Okay, so we were talking about settling the West, and we're talking about this big movement west of many people in a very brief or short period of time. And to do that, we're looking at the time period from the 1840s. We remember this is about the time when Americans have moved into Texas, and we have Texas that wins its independence and then joins the United States. It is also the time period of the Mexican-American War, where all of that territory that later becomes the western part of the United States has been settled by American citizens, and eventually, after the war, is taken by the American government in the treaty with Mexico, so it becomes American territory. But the main moment that is very key in the moving west is when gold is discovered, obviously in California in 1848, and we have the gold rush of 1849. The people moving west to find gold, to find their fortune, are called 49ers. And California booms in population, becomes a state in a very short period of time. For a brief moment, it too, like Texas, claimed its independence and was called the Bear Flag State Republic. So it said it was its own country, separated from Mexico, but eventually it becomes a state in a very short period of time because the population has increased catastrophically. But to move west, we create these towns, which are called boom towns, that rise up out of nothing in areas that are promising, usually for mining. So this is the main draw in this period of time, is the finding of different precious stones or minerals, not just gold, but also silver and other precious metals. And these towns rise up overnight. Once the mineral has been exhausted, there is no more to mine, or they have found that there in fact is no gold or no mineral in that area, then people move on. And these towns that grew overnight all of a sudden die overnight and become what we know as ghost towns, right? So towns where nobody lives anymore, they just abandon the buildings and they move on. Now, moving west, lots of people, you need communication and transportation. We mentioned the Pony Express, which is a very famous image here, a very famous moment in American history, brief moment, but a moment when mail was carried by horseback, relay, so in other words, one horseman and one horse goes from one point and then and passes on the mail to the next horseman and the next horse to carry it. And they stretched a 2,000-mile long route and were very quick in delivering mail. And then we have the famous building of the railway, the Transcontinental Railway. So it goes from one side to the other of the continent. They started building it from the east and they started building it from the west, and they met finally in the middle. And there's a video on that, so that explains that. We used a lot of immigrants for the hard labor in building this railroad, cutting through mountains in the Rocky Mountain areas and building up where there were valleys. So it was a very important construction project that united East and West. And so they're going to the West to find minerals, to mine. One of the most important methods of mining that was used at the time is what we call hydraulic mining. And obviously it comes from the word hydro, for water. So what they did is they took water from a stream or source, and they put it under high pressure, and they shot it against the mountainside or in the mine area, and the water washed away the dirt and the soil and the rocks and the minerals that they were looking for. And it went down what they call a sluice box, which is basically a channel that they build and an area where the dirt and the gravel gets carried away by the water, but the gold or the precious mineral goes to the bottom. It's heavier. So the dirt and the mud washes away, but the gold, the precious metal, stays on the bottom, and that's where they get it. They recover it from the bottom. Unfortunately, as you can see, they destroy large areas of land, and all of this mud and dirt goes down and is washed down into the river systems, and it overflows the river systems. The material that goes down to these streams and rivers starts causing great floods and destroying lots of farmland. So it ends up being an environmental disaster out here. Mostly we're talking about California, but also other parts like Colorado, etc. So hydraulic farming, or mining, was very effective. It was very cost effective for the miners, but it was very damaging to other people's property, to the farmers. And so eventually, you see here, in 1884, it was finally outlawed as a method of mining because it destroyed other people's property. It was damaging. Now, another important aspect of this moving west was the Great Plains area, where we have the Great Plains Indians, who are the Indians that you always see with the headdresses of feathers, riding on horses, going after the buffalo. That's the image you have of these Plains Indians. So we have the Great Plains in the middle. We talked about, let me jump ahead for a second. We talked about the East Coast being settled. We have the first 13 states here on the East Coast. And then we have pretty much everything settled up to the Mississippi River here. We have the Louisiana Territory that's bought from France in 1803. Texas comes in the 1840s, along with the rest of the West in the 1840s after the Mexican-American War. And by 49, we have also the treaty with Great Britain that gets these territories here for the United States. So this whole territory by this time is part of the United States. And the middle section here is what we call the Great Plains. This section here has very little population. The population is on the east, all the way up to the Mississippi and around the Mississippi. And now, with the big movement west, it's on the west coast. Let me go back. It's on the west coast. We have the Transcontinental Railroad that passes through the middle. But this Great Plains area has not been settled by a lot of people. It is most importantly the territory of the cowboy. All right, this is perfect land for grazing. It's perfect land for cattle. It's the land where the bison, where the buffalo roam, where they live, the buffalo herds. All right, so it's perfect land for buffalo, for cows, for horses. And this is where you have the iconic image of the American cowboy. And what do? They graze their cattle. In other words, they let their cattle eat the grass. That's grazing. They graze their cattle in this territory. And they have cattle drives, which are the moving of big herds are groups, big herds of cattle to the slaughterhouses. So where are the slaughterhouses? The slaughterhouses are like in Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri area. around here. So then they used the transportation of the Missouri River, of the Mississippi River, and then of the railroads that are here in the east to move the meat to eastern markets. So they have to move the cattle by making them walk all the way to the slaughterhouses. So either they come from the north and they go south, or they come from the south and they go north to the middle here, where are all the slaughterhouses. Slaughterhouses are where they kill the cattle for meat. Now, for a long period of time, this area was completely open, like you see here. There is no fence, there is no personal property where my cattle can graze and yours can't. They just freely moved through the entire middle part of the United States with these cattle drives. It was called the open range. Range is the open country space. This is a range. Home on the Range, if you've ever heard the song, is the open country that's free. Well, it didn't last too long because there was conflicts over territory and for grazing, but also for farming, because this is also a good farming area for grains. As you notice, I'm going back and forth on the slides. I'm jumping ahead to show you the map of the United States on the slide that's called the wheat belt. Why? Because this territory is also very good for growing different types of grains, such as wheat and corn and barley, any sort of grains that the cattle would eat. It's also good for farming. So they had to end up setting up these fenced-in areas, and they used what we call barbed wire fences. These barbed wire fences kept the cattle in certain areas and put an end to the open range. No longer free to come and go and to move where they wished, because it was fenced off with the barbed wire fences. Seward's Folly. So it's at this moment that Secretary of State William Seward decides to buy a territory far in the north near Russia. And so you don't even see on the map where Alaska really is, so you know it's up here in the corner. Remember from the beginning of our course, Alaska almost touches Russia, and during the Ice Age, it would have been all frozen over, so people would have crossed over from Asia through what is current day Russia over to Alaska, and then they would have come down to continental United States, New Mexico, Mexico, and then South America. So Alaska is far north, near Russia, and Russia wanted, basically they needed money. They didn't think it was a very important piece of land, and Seward saw its potential, and he said, yes, we should buy it from Russia. And basically, Seward was considered a fool. He was considered not intelligent to have bought Alaska, because it seemed just like an icebox. In other words, a big block of ice. Who cares about a big block of ice so far away? But they also called it the Polar Bear Garden. So they kind of made fun of it. He bought it for very little in terms of the territory. You can see how large Alaska is. They've put Alaska on top of the map of the United States to show that it stretches from one point of the United States, and including all of the Aleutian Islands, to the other point of the United States. And if you put Alaska on top of the map of Europe, you can just see how large Alaska is. It's almost the size of continental Europe. So it's a very big territory. He buys it for $7 million from the Russians. Very shortly thereafter, it was discovered that there was gold in Alaska, and therefore Seward's folly, right, his foolish purchase, wasn't so foolish. And again, we have another type of gold rush in 1898. There's another huge gold rush, but this time to Alaska and what is known as the Yukon Territory. This rush, this gold rush, inspires a lot of American literature and poetry at the time. So you probably will read some poetry or have read poetry about the Yukon, the discovery of gold in Alaska or in the Yukon Territory, maybe some Robert Service, or for example, books like White Fang or The Call of the Wild. Those are books that are written about this time period and the discovery of gold in Alaska. So it's a big literary theme. So finally, we're getting to the wheat belt. So the same territory that was the open range where cattle roamed freely now becomes what we call the wheat belt. In other words, this belt, essentially cintura, right, a cintura, this belt in the middle of America, the prairies of America, are a wonderful place for growing wheat and every type of crop like that. Any sort of grain crop is good for growing here. The most important thing is that you can grow 2 crops in the same year. The weather is very mild in the middle, so it's not too hot and it's not too cold. So you can grow winter wheat and you can grow spring wheat. You can get 2 crops of wheat. Right? So thanks to the hot and dry weather in the summer, and in the northern area, you can get spring wheat, right? Due to the more severe climate in the cold winters. So you can get both. You can get the winter wheat because of the dry and hot, and the spring wheat because of the cold winters. So it made it a good area for these huge, expansive farms. And this moved too fast. This brings us to what we call the bonanza farms, where it's no longer a farm, a single farm, a small farm, run by one person or one family. The extent of the territory makes it possible to have very, very large farms that are run by many people. It becomes a business almost right away. So you have lots of people that work together on a same large territory. And so these are called bonanza farms. So already here in the early times of the United States, we have mass production in farming, which is a new way of farming. You do not see this, for example, in Europe. There's just not these extensive areas, and they have not come up with this mass production of farming. And so this is where you have corporations of farmers that get together and create one gigantic farm, which means that food products can be cultivated with a lot fewer resources and much more efficiently. It makes the production of food much cheaper. Now, moving into this territory, it's obvious that the Americans, the white Americans, are going to be encountering the Native Americans who live in these areas, and there's going to be conflict. We mentioned already about some of the tribes being moved to reservations, and this takes place again in the plains areas. So there are a number of Indian wars that take place at this time with different tribes, and little by little the Indian resistance is overcome in these Indian wars, and the Indian tribes are sent to reservations. Many Indian tribes are sent to Oklahoma. It's probably the biggest area of Indian reservations in the United States. With the Indian Appropriations Act, these reservations were officially established by the U.S. government. And the most important Indian War that I think you should know will be the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which I also have you watch a video on that as well. So it's Custer's Last Stand. It's probably one of the most iconic moments of these Indian Wars. So I use it as an example of the Indian Wars, but there are many different wars with many different tribes. So the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand, is a battle in the Montana Territory. Let me flash back. Here's Montana up here, so it's up in the north, and the Indians of that area are the Lakota Sioux. The Lakota is the name that we use and we get for the states that are right next to Montana: North Dakota and South Dakota. Right? So that's where we get these names: the Lakota and the Dakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne, which is also the name of a place in the United States. The Cheyenne tribe. Their warriors are holding out against the American military, which is trying to protect American settlers who are moving west and are being attacked by the Indians who are defending their homeland. The specific area of this battle, of this last stand, which would be the last moment that he's standing, literally, are called the Black Hills in the Montana Territory. So he, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, Custer's Last Stand, and this is a picture of Custer, was a colonel in the Civil War. Now, we're talking after the Civil War. This is 1876. We remember the Civil War ends in 1865, right? So we're about 10 years later. He is in the Black Hills in the Montana Territory protecting settlers and trying to overcome the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne. The most important Indians in this conflict are Sitting Bull, the chief, and this is a picture of him, and Crazy Horse, who is a young warrior who is very important in the tribe, and he is eventually killed, but he is captured by the, not Custer, but the American military. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse overcome Custer and his men. Custer underestimates the forces of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. He does not think that they are as powerful as they really are. And he is overwhelmed, and all of the American military at that battle are killed. So it's Custer's last stand, the last day that he stands alive. All of his men are killed. No one survives. It's the biggest massacre, if you will, of the American military in these Indian Wars. It's the most famous moment, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Now, obviously, the U.S. Army, defeated in this conflict, comes back with more forces, and within 5 years, they subdue the Sioux and the Cheyenne, and they are confined to reservations. They capture Crazy Horse, and he's killed, and they overcome them all. But this was a big moment in the Indian Wars that gave the Indians hope that they might be able to resist. But the Americans kept coming, and the U.S. government obviously sent more men. The Dawes Act, the Dawes-Servilty Act, was a law that tried to do something good for the Indians. The politicians, the Americans who were moving into the area, understood that the American Indian had all of this territory at his disposition. It was a vast territory. They felt there could be room for all of us, white Americans and Native Americans. We can all live on this territory. It's a big territory. We just need to divide it up into reasonable areas of land. Some of the land the Native Americans can have, and some of the land the white Americans can have. Unfortunately, that is not how the Native Americans live. The Native Americans in that area, in fact, lived in teepees. These are teepees. They were migrant peoples. They followed the herds of buffalo. They were free people. They moved freely in their territories. Their territories were vast. They were not peoples that settled down into square lots like American settlers. So the American settlers were trying to impose upon the Native Americans a certain mentality, a way of living, a way of thinking that was not the way of living and the way of thinking of the Native Americans. And so what the Dawes Act did was it divided the territory of 160 acres to each head of household. It divided the territory and gave the territory to each Indian head, thus giving them large territories, but not the way they were used to living. They could not keep their traditional way of life, which was a nomadic way of life. So the Native Americans then who received this land, the important thing was they would become U.S. citizens, which again, this was supposed to be something positive. Remember when the African Americans get freed from slavery, then they also are given citizenship, right, by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They become citizens and therefore subject to the laws of the United States, but also beneficiaries of rights under the United States Constitution. So the Dawes Act, although it had negative consequences for the Native Americans and their way of life, was trying to actually help them. It was not done with malicious intent. It was not passed in order to suppress the Indians. It was an actual effort to help them and to help them become citizens, to help them have land, have their territory, and live freely. So they were, like I put here in bold, they were genuinely interested in the welfare of the Native Americans. However, it just was not consonant with their way of life, right? So the Native American life deteriorated in a manner not anticipated by its sponsors. They didn't intend to hurt the Native Americans. They intended to give them justice, to give them land, to give them rights as citizens. But unfortunately, the consequences were the basically annihilation of the Native American way of life on the open plains. And you can see here I've included a map of Oklahoma, which is the biggest reservation territory in the United States. You can see each of the nations have their territory, right, assigned to them: Cheyenne, Arapaho, the Wichita, Caddo, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, the Creek, and the Cherokee. The Cherokee Nation, remember, here's also the Cherokee Outlet. The Cherokee Nation was the nation that was moved from Georgia in the Trail of Tears march under President Jackson. Right? So slowly the Indians are all moved into different territories and given plots of land with good intentions under the Dawes Act, but not the best thing for the Native American way of life. And so that brings us to the end of this section that concentrates on the important vocabulary words, if you will, the important moments in the history of the United States in this time of moving westward, of settling the West. Right? So with that, I will leave you. I will not interrogate you on anyone. On Tuesday, we will continue with explanation. All right, make sure that you've watched the 4 videos. Okay? So there are 4 different arguments that are important. Watch the videos and take notes on the videos. As you noticed, I am not having you read the textbook, okay? So I'm not including that even in your didactic part. So don't worry about the textbook. I think you'll have enough just looking at the slides and watching the videos, okay? So I'll see you on Tuesday.